Sylvia, one of the things that we have tried to do is these rebate checks that go to Americans, the federal top-up on unemployment insurance, which is run by the states, the Paychex Protection Program, in which companies get grants if they keep their people on payroll, and the remarkably interesting effort that went through the airlines, in which the airlines received grants to keep their people on payroll. This is a much more European concept than it is an American concept, but it's actually not a bad one. If the government pays companies to keep people on payroll rather than have them, get off their payroll, apply for unemployment, that's an unwieldy process. Apply for health care, that's an unwieldy process. What can we do once we're out of this emergency period, this first period that we've thought about, the first 3 months, in terms of keeping workers going?
Well, I mean, what you're saying is exactly right. What a lot of the European countries are doing, and they're doing it much more efficiently than we were, is to directly take over payroll, nationalize payroll. That would have been the best thing to do right off the bat. Instead, we have a lot of people unemployed. Some are on temporary layoff. That's good because you're keeping the link between workers and their jobs. We had the PPE that's going to help small and medium-sized businesses hopefully stay afloat and be viable when we can start to reasonably open up, and they'll have workers to go because, ready. Because what we do not want is to have everybody being delinked from their employer and their employment, and small businesses and medium businesses closing down in droves, because that means we're going to take a situation where I try to remind people, don't forget, we did this on purpose. We have 30 million people filing UI claims, unemployment insurance claims. And to my mind, that's a good thing because we were trying to do this. We're simply moving too quickly into the next phase to opening up. But, as much as we can keep workers tied to their jobs, the better off we'll be in the long run.
Do you really think the government can keep people on the payroll for the length of this until we get a vaccine? Isn't that going to be a huge stretch on the government and the economy and for the long term?
Well, it's certainly a huge stretch, but don't forget we're in the nascent stage here. There's a lot of work being done, which was just discussed quite a bit here at the top of your program. We're the richest country in the world. We could do a lot more. Countries with, not as much as we have are doing a lot more. So I think, yes, we can do it. Can we do it until there's a vaccine? I'm not so sure, but certainly we have to keep things in place, as the medical community is all saying, until we have some reasonable amount of testing, tracing, and isolating, so we can do a better job at keeping people safe and healthy, and certainly to keep tampering down the rate of growth of the infection so we don't have such, explosions in infections that we overwhelm the healthcare system. So I think we're really early in the early stages. We're annually a $22 trillion economy. I think there's a lot of room to move here. And one of the biggest things we have to do is make sure that DC delivers to state and local governments so we don't start adding teachers and firemen and policemen to the unemployment ranks.